4, 5 and 6 you would have learned how in the late 19th century to early 20th century ethnic categories slowly began to regionally shape the interiors of Kasai, and it did not always matter about one's origin to establish which category they will be inserted into. This leaves us to look at the western to central and southern regions in Kasai, which would have been first inhabited by Shien, Kete and Konda speaking populations prior to the development of kingdoms outside of its region. A reminder, from at least the 17th to 18th century, populations from the Luba kingdom would have undergone internal disputes and simultaneously expanded their rule and territory outside of the Luba homeland in Kananga. A population of Kiluba speakers left the Luba kingdom to formulate a kingdom with populations found roughly around the northeast fringes in Angola, bordering the southern Kasai river region. This kingdom became known as the Lunda kingdom, which was documented to be running parallel with the Luba kingdom throughout the 17th to 19th century. By the middle of the 18th century, the Lunda kingdom would have set up trade relations with an Angolan kingdom known as Kasanje kingdom. This Kasanje kingdom relayed their trade from the Lunda kingdom with traders on the coast of Angola. This caused some Kete and Konda speaking populations to flee further to the northern centres within Kasai, and some Kete and Konda populations were either absorbed or integrated into the Kuba kingdom. By the late 18th century, what we know today as Basonge would have already been situated in the southern eastern Kasai regions. Other groups from either the Luba kingdom or its surrounding states would also find themselves settled on the eastern fringes of the Lomami district in southeastern Kasai. Not limited to, but some of the most notables of these populations are today known as Baluba Shankadi and Ganyoka. It is very important to highlight most of these Luba states were established northwards between two rivers we know today as the Lomami River and the Lualaba River. These northward routes from the Kananga region up to eastern sides of the Sankuru district towards Manyema would have also served as a means of transporting conquered captives to Luba trading partners who are linked to the coast of East Africa or the coast of Angola. The transportation of these captives began to slow down approaching the mid-19th century, partially due to the alleged abolishment of slavery by Europeans and partially due to Konda speaking populations retaliating against the Sultan Swahili Arabs. Understanding the geography between Lomami and Lualaba River will help us understand what is being documented as Baluba for the mid to late 19th century. For example, when the Sultan Swahili Arabs and the Europeans began to penetrate the course between the Lomami River and the Lualaba River, they called this whole region Baluba land, irrespective if some populations had come from Konda speaking populations. You will notice the documented Baluba land are along the eastern fringes of Kasai up to Manyema. Should this statement sound too strong, it will be useful to explore the earliest mapped out routes traders had set up throughout the landmass we know as DR Congo. You will also notice the trade routes run along the central southern borders of kingdoms known as the Lunda and Luba kingdom, which were generally outside the Kasai district. This pictorial evidence further demonstrates that the northern Kasai to its southern centres were evidently unexplored, even in these early stages of this mid-19th century. Using the same foundational records which were used to imply key events within Baluba Kasai history, we can identify in the mid-19th century the notable Swahili Arabs did not reach the Sankuru River to discover a population today referred to as Baluba Kasai. These used records also make reference to the Sultan Swahili Arabs using the same trade routes which were mapped out by Angolan slave traders. For example, the Sultan Swahili Arabs had trade-related clashes with their Lunda kingdom partners and ventured away from this clash in an eastern direction south of the Lunda kingdom. They reached a river known as the Luapala River and travelled north to discover a people who they identified as Baluba. This discovery of Baluba was not in Kasai but in Kananga. Another important thing to highlight is one of the invading Europeans visited Kasongolushi in Manyema, and the invading European wanted to cross the Lomami River to reach the Sankuru River, which would have taken him roughly to this centre region of Kasai. Do point out Kasongolushi's Utotera location within Manyema is adjacent to the eastern side of the district, known as Sankuru district and Lomami district. Within this transcript, there was no mention of Baluba, and the transcript instead implied the Utotera chief Kasongolushi would have been communicating with people that likely understood a Songe language, and the chief on the left bank of the Lomami River instead threatened the European if he trespasses into his country. There's an oral tale pertaining to a late 19th century event which shaped the Baluba Kasai category. The summary of the oral tale is that a Maluba chief's wife informed a Batetela chief named Ngongolutet about an area he can raid for slaves eastwards of his location. Though within this tale there was no direct details on the location he is to raid, the Europeans' eisegesis of this event goes on to explain the Maluba chief's wife was referring to the territory of Shiluba-speaking people known as Bakwakalonji. Another development of this tale is Ngongolutet raided the area known as Ngandazika, which is in the western fringes within the Lomami district. Should this story be true, it could have been associated with historical Baluba against Baluba disputes, as populations of Ngandazika may have had connections with the Gazembes of the Lunda kingdoms, who killed a Muluba Shankadi chief, who was her husband, hence why she wanted Ngongolutet to raid them. This story is the main information amplified as today's Baluba Kasai peoples being slave raided by Arab slavers or Batetela. Under close examination of the least popular to most popular records surrounding these tales, it becomes easily clear if these raids did occur, they were conducted by Baluba people themselves. Also, the earliest text regarding these raids to Luba Kasai makes no reference to a Baluba on the left side of the Lomami district. Reference is only made to the Basonge on the east within the Lomami district. Regardless, this narrative has been developed into a perceived fact by Europeans and American missionary schools of the 1890s. It's very important to note Ngongolutet's slave raiding territory was around the Manyema up to the Lomela region, where the Lomami River begins to join what we know as the Congo River. These earliest transcripts and records highlight Ngongolutet's raids on the left bank of the Lomami River actually devastated areas of the Sankuru district adjoining Manyema up to Basonge territory in the Lomami district. Further to this narrative about raids in Kasai, it was added that the now known Luba Kasai fled westwards from Ngongolutet's slave raids within Kasai, ending up in the regions we know today as Ngandazika up to Mbuji. If this happened, this means the Bakwakalonji would have been living within the eastern side of the Lomami district, within the Basonge's Milembwe and Beneki states in the late 1880s, which is not historically true. Consider even if Ngongolutet crossed the left bank of the Lomami from a position further south of the Lomami River by Lubashankadi lands, he would have first had to bump into the Kanyoka, who the Muluba Shankadi wanted killed for revenge. That's something to think about. When invading Europeans made reference to devastated villages that they encountered along their expeditions in 1890, it could have been Basonge villages, as Basonge already had a history of fleeing and being raided by Sultan Swahili Arabs amongst their kin, as are demonstrated in part 5. Also, the woman who Ngongolutet allegedly spoke to was a Muluba of the Shankadi family who resided closer to Katanga. Therefore, what language was she and Ngongolutet communicating in? If we want to discover when and where the nucleus of Baluba Kasai Shiluba speakers began, we must go back to southern fringes of Kasai. If we cannot find this Shiluba nucleus around the late 19th century Baluba lands, between the regions of Lomami and Lualaba rivers, we will look at the far southern Kasai area. On the basis, there is a Baluba Kasai oral tale which states there was once an 18th century kingdom in the center of Kasai, which was developed by migrants from the Lunda kingdom in the late 17th century. I will touch more on this shortly. If we recall, the Lunda kingdom's trade activities would have impacted Bakete and Konda speaking populations. As with other kingdoms, the Lunda kingdom would have incorporated its surrounding captives, thus supplying enslaved captives to their trade partners on their east and west. Considering one of the developers of the Lunda kingdom was the son of a Muluba man named Ilunga Mbidi, who was also documented as the founder of the Luba kingdom, we can ascertain the Kiluba, Yembe and Mbinzi languages would have reached the Lunda region. As with other kingdoms developed by trade, the Lunda kingdom would have also developed a trade language, incorporating the languages of all the Lunda kingdom inhabitants. The language of trade within this Lunda kingdom would be best described as Rund. It's useful to identify the captives taken into the Lunda kingdom from Kasai would not have been able to properly pronounce Rund, and they would have said Lund. With expanding populations, the Rund language of trade would have likely developed Shiluba roughly around the 18th century, radiating from the northern fringes of the Lunda kingdom, which would have been the area around the southern end of the then known Kasabe River, which today is the Kasai River. By the end of the 19th century, there would have been already populations fleeing disputes or captivity from the Lunda kingdom. We can ascertain those who fled north of the Lunda kingdom ventured through southern Kasai and absorbed or mixed with Gete populations, who they discovered through the mid-18th century to late 19th century. For example, the Sankuru River runs into the southern center of Kasai, where it is also called Lubilange or Lubilash River. The indigenous Shian Gete speaking populations of this region were nicknamed Bashilange people, which later became a category synonymous with Shiluba speakers, and you will understand why as I continue to demonstrate. By the end of the mid-19th century, other populations from the Lunda kingdom would be already settled by a river known today as the Lulua River in western Kasai. They set up their own trading state there, which was ruled by a Shiluba speaking man named Kalamba Mukenge. Kalamba Mukenge would go on to conquer the surrounding Kete and Konda speaking populations in central Kasai, and he set up trade routes linked to Angolan traders and the Bakuba kingdom. Approaching the late 19th century, these Lulua river regions, with all the absorbed populations incorporated into West Kasai, would have formulated a nucleus of people speaking the language of Kalamba Mukenge's trade, which would be Shiluba, irrespective of their ethnic backgrounds. Kalamba Mukenge stopped Ngongolutet from reaching the centers of Kasai, which is something important to consider, as it interferes with the oral tale that Ngongolutet raided Baluba Kasai. One must wonder what language was used between Kalamba Mukenge and Ngongolutet's communication, if also this story is true. Kalamba Mukenge's alliance with invading Europeans included incorporating his Shiluba-speaking men into the force publique, who went on expeditions across the whole of DR Congo. The Europeans also carried a caravan of Shiluba speakers from today's Mbuji Mayi regions into Western Kasai's American Missionary School in a place called Luebo. Luebo in West Kasai began to develop another Shiluba speaking nucleus, which spread as far as Lusambo within the Tetela Sankuru district. These Shiluba speakers would also be developed to act under the rule of the Nsapu Nsapu and Kalamba Mukenge, as per Europeans. Whilst Kalamba Mukenge grew powerful with support of the Europeans, he began to fall into disputes with his Angolan slave trading partners, who would eventually raid his trading state in West Kasai, bringing it to an end in the late 19th century. Consider this was another concurrently running narrative demonstrating Shiluba speakers, also known as Baluba Kasai, being raided. In this same late 19th century, the Lunda Kingdom kings would also fall into disputes with their slave trading partners from Angola, who raided their kingdom, thus causing many populations of the Lunda Kingdom to disperse into South Kasai, joining already established Shiluba speakers towards the centre of Kasai. It is extremely important to note there were a variety of populations inhabiting the Lunda Kingdom as a result of trade with the Sultan Swahili Arabs and Ambaquistas venturing as far as the Luba Kingdom, thus creating populations of ethnically ambiguous and ethnically mixed populations. I state this to highlight some populations leaving the Lunda Kingdom after its fall were found to have had phenotypes distinct from the Bakete and Konda speaking populations as a result of trade, and the Europeans amplified these phenotypical traits as Baluba traits. When Europeans went to the southeastern regions of Kasai, they also discovered populations speaking Yembe, Mbinzi and other languages akin to Kiluba, such as Shankadi and Ganyoka. In this late 19th century period, European missionaries began calling all these populations Baluba due to language similarity, if not culture as well. It did not matter if one came from Konda or Kete speaking populations. For example, some documented as savages and from the eastern Kasai were called Baluba, approaching the end of the late 19th century. In the early 20th century, Europeans also began repatriating and or bringing in what they deemed to be Baluba populations from Angola via the southern entrance of the Kasai district. They were presented as ex-enslaved returnees to Kasai, presumably on the basis as the Atlantic slave trade was allegedly abolished, it would have left populations stranded closer to the coast of Angola. These populations would have also been placed in reputable positions within the Belgian Congo administration to help the Europeans evangelize the local populations or carry out military duties. I state this to highlight a notable from the presented returnees is a man named Shalombo, who was part of the Europeans' evangelization scheme, which involved encouraging local populations to come away from their so-called primitive lifestyle, burn their sculptures and artifacts in replacements for the Bible. Up to the mid-20th century, Europeans was presenting to the Western world a Luba Bambo category, which was the synonym for the later Luba Kasai. It is not clear if the Europeans' projection of a phrase Baluba Bambo was to super project the term Baluba slaves, or if it was a name associated with buffalo areas beyond the southern Kasai River, considering some of Kasai's chiefs had crowns depicting horns of a buffalo, which could be associated. To not get confused with geography, it is extremely important to decipher the then Kasabe River, known as Kasai River, should not be confused with the later Kasai District, Occidental and Oriental. Kasai is a province named after the Kasai River, which reaches the northeast fringes of Angola. Those who watch parts 2 may already understand this. The Luba Bambo category would begin to disappear approaching the late 1950s, possibly due to the ambiguous meaning and the emerging geographical related politics, which I will touch on later in this series. The Baluba Kasai label eventually superseded the Baluba Bambo label, and with the emerging geographical related politics, another Baluba category was amplified, known as Lulua, referring to Baluba Kasai in the west by the Lulua River, which implied the Baluba Kasai in the east now represent the nucleus of the category Baluba Kasai. This Luba Kasai category was also accompanied with an oral tale summarizing the Baluba Kasai came from a place named Nsangalubangu, around the areas of the Baluba homeland in Katanga. In brief summary, some of the Baluba from the Baluba homeland in Katanga developed their own understanding that those known as Luba Kasai are not Baluba, and their ethnic category was a construction of the invading Europeans, and they used linguistic examples such as Baluba Shankadi, Basonge, Kanyoka and some others, whose languages was closer to Kiluba than Shiluba. I state this to highlight, whilst oral stories can be vague and whilst there's a plethora of sidelined information which demonstrates Europeans' role in constructing ethnicity, I disagree with the overgeneralization that Baluba Kasai are not from the Baluba homeland, solely on the basis the oldest oral records, linguistics and some family names at least link some Baluba Kasai to the Lunda kingdoms, if not the Luba kingdom in Katanga. For example, running concurrently with the Sangalumbangu oral tale was a 1960s presentation as the Jews of Congo, specifically radiating from a Luba Kasai family known as Bakwadishi, who some have highlighted their lineage goes back to one of the documented founders of the Lunda kingdom named Shibanda Ilunga, whose son was the first Mwat Yaab, bearing the name Mwata Mutombo. Whether or not Sangalumbangu existed, Mwat Yaav origins via the Lunda kingdom is still associated with links to the Luba kingdom. However, the notable Angolan populations of course come from their Angolan coastal trade states, which is not a debate. In summary, it would appear the nucleus of the Luba Kasai emerged from the Lunda kingdom, and consider the fact there are presentations explaining Shiluba speakers were sought for as slaves during the Atlantic slave trade. This places them within the vicinity of the slave trade routes. Invading Europeans have since demonstrated their politically driven regulation of the Baluba Kasai category has been done at the social expense of Shiluba speakers, as they have projected them as slaves, victims, conquerors and enslavers, all within the same era, causing an eruption of contradictions difficult to explain away in short sentences. Here are some examples. A Luebo based Baluba Kasai group within the Force Publique was documented to have massacred and cannibalized a community in so-called Batetela lands. However, the American missionaries preferred to amplify the family name and Nsapu as perpetrators instead of Baluba as perpetrators. There would have been further contradictions if the Europeans referred to Bena Tshiyamba as Batetela. Another example, early reports on brutality or savagery was documented to have been exercised by Baluba. For instance, it was a custom to mutilate noses and ears of enslaved captives before invading Europeans mutilated indigenous Mongol populations in the equator regions. Under closer examination, you will find most of the Baluba kingdom and its states were established for the purposes of enslaving populations from their north and even making them socially Baluba. Contradiction narratives also occur. For instance, some of the Bakwadishi which I mentioned earlier had an oral tale summarizing they descend directly from the Lunda kingdom's first king, Mwata Mutombo. Further to this tale, in summary, Mwata Mutombo's descendants would set up a kingdom named after a river called Dishi in the center of Kasai in the late 17th century. On the basis this story is true, it conflicts with the earlier Baluba Katanga Genesis story and conflicts with the notion the Baluba Kasai suffered at the hands of the Arabs when the slave manifest documents specifically reference Manyema regions. What also didn't help is the Europeans' ethnographic records on Baluba is vague, considering the Baluba Kasai ethnographic category was not in existence approaching the late 19th century. Ethnographic captions with Baluba Kasai only began several decades later. Another conflicting narrative is the invading Europeans considered the so-called Bakuba akin to Baluba in prestige and attempted to imply the origins of what they were calling the first Basonge people is Baluba people, who were conquered by Sudanese populations in the 17th century, which is obviously not true, but under close examination it is self-admittance that all the Konda speaking people who they deemed as prestige were categorized as Baluba. I will demonstrate this to you later in this series. As you would have guessed, it was never going to be a straight line to understand how Baluba Kasai became Baluba Kasai and later Baluba Jews, whose story implies many would have remained unaffected for 200 years within their Bakwadishi kingdom in central Kasai until they were found by Europeans who moved some of them to Luebo and Lusambo and other areas where diamonds had been found. The Lulua Baluba of West Kasai are now perhaps left with the Sangalubangu narrative, and the Baluba of Ngandazika are left to decide whether they are Baluba Jews of the Bakwadishi kingdom and or from Sangalubangu with the Basonge, who they share the Lomami district with. In relation to what we generally know today as Baluba Kasai people, many are our great prosperous people and are able to demonstrate their greatness outside of today's modern reputable statuses and social positions. Do not confuse any unfavorable fact I have presented as an attack on what we know today as Baluba Kasai. Stay tuned for part 8, where we will examine the whole story, as the whole story clears up some ethnographic confusion.
Soki nalobi ngale ya kutenga mayobongisa. Kolobete o yebili ngale te memu chinu mungale wale. Memu yo. Bandeko likamuna so bande nangulelo izaya bolingo eponie kolite. Bolingo eponie kolite nakati ya Yesu Kristo. Bolingo eponie kolite nakati ya Yesu Kristo. Bolingo. Ngai na goma keo le 25 février 1977. Na yagina mutuka, na yagina avion te, na yagina mutuka ya Chango Zaire. Tatuendo wa Ali Chibala. Bandeko. Koya na ngai mbale ya liboso. Na zo yebi sabino likambo. Bandeko, na sale nini? Balobi na ngai kabongo lukulo oye célibataire bolingo eponie kolite okobala mosi nyonsi yo komona wana mbongo na ngai akobala ekoki ngai na Equateur na koma na Equateur na kuteni na mwana mosi aba mwongo kombo na ye Jeta Mobula Georgette Mobula na lobi na ye boy Georgette Mobula, j'arrive ici pour vous marier, vous n'avez bien vous mbere. Georgette alobi na ngai olobini yo kanisi makamo kolobo na ngai na yebite to ai na kekwala na biso ayebi français ngana lobite na yapo na bale yo olingi ngai bia olingi te mwana wana lobi ngana kana likamute kaka baboti na ngai biso kote ya baboti na ye baboti na ye yebisi ngai papa biso tsana likamute makasi na yo na poshi na yo ngana bimisi eloko na ngai ya mutuya na pesi bango papa accordé yango alobi wali mubali ya sol tala merci tokoma kote wana moya mosi ayi kutuna ngai magamo mususu yo ali ekole nini ngana kanisa zote ngai ekole ngana tanga ngana yebisi ngai ekole na ngai ekole katolika alebia wali ekole katolika meme ekole katolika na Mbuji eri na ekole na Mbuji ndi alobi wali muluba meme na ali muluba ya sol bandeko na pesi biloko olieba pesa ngai mwana mwasi lukula na Mbuji babali saka apesi mwana muke agende kutika yaya na ye bapesi ngai kaka biloko na bantaba malukwe tukitina maluku